The game of Battleship is fairly straightforward. Two players place their ships on a grid and take turns guessing shots to try and sink the other's ships first. Winning requires strategy in placing your ships, intuition as to where your opponent placed theirs, and a bit of luck. While the basic concept had existed as early as the 1930s, it was only in 1967 that the board game known as Battleship was first released, featuring the now iconic twin cases and pegboards. Not only was the board game a huge success, but its relative simplicity and unique gameplay made it look like a prime candidate to be converted into video game form. While an electronic version of the board game was released in 1977 featuring sound effects and flashing lights, though, it took until the 1990s for any serious console adaptations to materialize. Enter Battleship for the Philips CDI, released in 1991. The CDI was a flop, and likewise so was the game. Exit Battleship for the CDI. However, things were about to change as the license for the game would be acquired by Mindscape in 1992, and by 1993 the studio best known for creating Mavis Beacon would publish Battleship onto the NES, Game Boy, and Game Gear. Battleship, not to be confused with Battleship or Battleship, was a radical departure from both Battleship and Battleship. Instead of just playing the same game of Battleship over and over again, the game sees you work your way through a variety of different levels centered around the basic gameplay of Battleship. There's 40 of these levels in total, each featuring new weapons and differing assortments of ships. While Battleship did reasonably well, it was only released onto 8-bit consoles during a time when the 16-bit Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo were far and away the most popular systems on the market. However, this wasn't the only Battleship title published by Mindscape. 1993 also saw the release of Super Battleship. Super Battleship for the Sega Genesis was developed by Synergistic and released in 1993, and once again it's as much of a departure from Battleship as Battleship was to Battleship. The game features both Classic and Super Battleship modes, each offering entirely different experiences from each other. Starting off with Classic Battleship, it's a faithful part of the original board game that sees you face off against the computer. Unfortunately, even on the highest difficulty it's not very challenging, and there's no way to play against another human to offset this. Sure, then there'd be the problem of the opponent seeing your ships, but come on, everyone's capable of leaving the room for 2 minutes. However, Super Battleship mode is a completely different beast with almost nothing in common with the board game. It's still a naval-themed turn-based strategy game at its core, but that's where most of the similarities end. Instead of the traditional grid format, you and your opponent are placed at different positions in the ocean and have to sail your ships into range before you can attack. Combat sees you enter a short real-time sequence where you have to aim and fire your weapons at the enemy ship as they shoot back. At any point you can either retreat from the combat sequence, useful to avoid excessive damage, or continue firing. As for the weapons themselves, there are 4 types here. The most common ones used are the cannons, which have the largest supply of ammunition and have a fairly high rate of fire, but do the least damage and need to be pointed directly at the enemy ship in order to hit. Torpedoes are some of the most useful weapons in the game, doing huge damage, but only work relatively close up. However, they're also easier to use than the cannons, as you only have to aim left and right to hit and have a larger margin of error. Missiles are some of the most difficult to aim weapons in the game, as after you fire them, you need to press the A button at a specific point in order to hit the enemy ship. While this makes them frustrating to use at times, they also have both the longest range and do the most damage out of any weapon in the game. The final weapon available is the depth charge. It has the shortest range out of all of the weapons in the game and can only be used against submarines. The short range means you have to be directly above them before attacking, and it often takes several turns just to get into position. A different combat screen is present here, where you have to adjust the height at which the depth charges explode in order to hit the enemy submarine underwater. However, While you have access to all of these weapons, the only ones that the computer can use are the standard cannons. This raises the question of how enemy ships deal with your submarines. In short, they don't. Or rather, you don't. While Super Battleship mode features all of the same ships from the classic mode, there is one minor exception. Only your opponent is allowed to use submarines. Way to let me down at the very end, game. Did I forget to mention that this also came out on the Super Nintendo? Maybe I should have said that earlier.